My wife Amanda has always been socially active. Constant meetings, corporate events, bachelorette parties, it was part of her life. I didn't ask too many questions. We had been together for almost 10 years, and I thought that trust was the foundation of our relationship. And then it all came crashing down in one evening. Amanda said she was going to a conference for the weekend. She kissed me before she left, and I didn't even doubt her words. But a few hours after she left, I received a message from our mutual friend Ben. "Hey man, I just saw Amanda at the mall. Are you back from your trip yet?" I didn't answer right away. At first I thought he was confused. But then I just decided to check. I arrived at the mall and walked through the halls, as if I were casually strolling. And there she was, Amanda. She was holding some man's hand, laughing like she hadn't laughed with me in a long time. I didn't approach her. I just watched. When they got into the car and drove away, I called a taxi and followed them. They stopped at a small hotel outside the city. I stayed in the car until they disappeared behind the door. All night I sat in my car nearby, just thinking about what to do next. I did not feel angry, but rather empty. The next morning, I went up to the hotel lobby and asked for the key to room 204, introducing myself as her husband. The receptionist didn't even blink, he handed me the key and wished me a good day. I quietly opened the door. Amanda was sleeping, wrapped in a blanket, and her friend was taking a shower. I put our wedding photos on the nightstand next to her phone and a note. I hope it was a good conference. I left the key on the table and left. That evening she came home as if nothing had happened. She started telling me about the trip, inventing every detail. I sat silently listening to it all, and only when she was done did I say, "Next time, check who is watching you." Amanda froze, looked at me with wide-open eyes, and couldn't say another word. She sat across from me, her face gradually turning pale. In her hands she was clutching a glass of wine, from which she never took a single sip. "What do you mean?" she whispered, although she understood everything perfectly. I just looked at her without answering. Amanda tried to find some words, but they were stuck somewhere deep inside. "Were you there?" she finally managed to get out. "I was everywhere, Amanda," I said calmly, looking her straight in the eye. She set her glass on the table, her hands nervously tugging at the edge of her sweater. "It's not what you think," she began, but I waved her off. "Don't even try," I interrupted. "I saw everything. I even listened to your stories about the trip." The room was filled with silence. Even the clock on the wall seemed to be ticking louder than usual. "It was just once," she finally said, but her voice was trembling. I laughed. Deftly, without emotion. "One time? Amanda, I saw you in the city a few weeks ago. I don't think it was once." She lowered her head. "Why didn't you say something right away?" I sighed and leaned back. "I wanted to see how far you would go. Now I know." Amanda sat silently, her eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time in our marriage, I saw her like this, helpless and weak. But I didn't care anymore. "Do you want a divorce?" she asked quietly, without looking up. I pulled an envelope out of my pocket and put it on the table in front of her. "Everything is prepared here. If you sign it, I'll give it to the lawyer." She looked at the envelope as if it might explode at any moment. "Alex. I didn't want it to end like this," she finally said. "Neither did I," I replied, standing up. "But you made a choice. And now I'm making mine." I took the keys from the cabinet and walked to the exit. Before I closed the door behind me, I heard her muffled cries. From that night on, I never went home again. A few weeks later, I moved to a small apartment near the city center. My life became quieter, calmer. I stopped checking her social media or being interested in her life. And one day, when I was leaving a cafe, I heard a familiar voice. Alex? I turned around. It was Amanda. She was standing alone on the sidewalk, holding her phone. Hi, I answered dryly. She smiled nervously. Can I invite you for coffee? Just to talk. I looked at her for a few seconds. I think we've said everything we need to say, Amanda. Her smile disappeared. I'm really sorry, she said, barely audible. I nodded. Maybe you are. But it didn't matter to me anymore. I turned and walked on, not even looking back. That day I realized that betrayal doesn't always leave wounds. Sometimes it just closes a door that should have been closed long ago. A few months after that meeting, I almost forgot about Amanda. Life moved on, and every day I felt less and less attached to the past. One night I was sitting in a bar with Ben, the same friend who had once accidentally opened my eyes to everything. We were laughing about something insignificant when he suddenly became serious. Alex, I have to tell you something. He twirled his beer glass in his hands as if searching for words. What is it? Amanda wrote to me. I raised my eyebrows, but nothing twitched inside. What did she want? She asked how you were doing. She said she was sorry for everything. I nodded and took a sip of beer. Did you leak her number? No, Ben laughed a little. I told her that you've moved on and don't want to dredge up the past. Thank you, I replied, feeling grateful that he said it for me. We went back to talking about soccer, and Amanda never came up in our conversations again. One evening, on my way home from work, I went to the supermarket. I bought the usual things: milk, bread, coffee. In the checkout line, there was a woman with her daughter who kept turning around and looking at the shelves with chocolate. When she turned her head, I accidentally met her eyes. Alex? I squinted a bit until I recognized her. Lauren? Lauren was a former classmate of mine. We used to spend a lot of time together as students, but we parted ways after graduation. God, it's been a long time, she said, smiling. More than 10, I replied, watching her daughter pull a chocolate bar off the shelf. Is this your daughter? Yes, this is Emily. Say hello, Emily. The little girl looked at me with suspicion and just waved her hand shyly. How are you? Lauren asked while the cashier was checking out our purchases. Not bad. And you? I live, work, raise a child. She shrugged her shoulders a little. I got divorced a few years ago. I nodded in understanding. So did I. She looked at me carefully, as if trying to understand how much I had changed over the years. Maybe we can have coffee sometime, she suggested. I thought about it for a second. Why not? We exchanged numbers. As I left the supermarket, I felt something shift inside me. It was not just a meeting with an old friend. It was a sign that new pages in my life were just beginning to be written. And this time, I wasn't going to miss the chance. A week later, Lauren and I met in a small cafe in the city center. She was sitting by the window and waved at me when I walked in. Hi, I said, sitting down across from her. Hi. I hope you haven't been waiting too long. No, I'm just in time. Lauren ordered tea and I ordered my usual black coffee. The conversation started easily, as if we hadn't seen each other for months instead of years. You've always been a black coffee drinker, she laughed as I took my first sip. Some things don't change. And some things do, Lauren said quietly, and I understood what she meant. She told me a little about her life after university, about her marriage that didn't work out, about working at a local school, and about raising Emily. And you? How are you? She asked, looking at me carefully. I took a sip of coffee and sighed. It's a long story. I broke up with Amon. I paused for a second. Well, it's over now. Lauren smiled with understanding. The main thing is that you're moving on. I nodded. I was. We talked for several hours until the sun began to set. At some point, Lauren looked at her watch and got up. "Oh, I have to pick Emily up from her club. Let me give you a ride." She was surprised, but agreed. We were silent in the car. It was a strange feeling, like returning to our student days, but with older faces and other stories behind us. When we arrived at the school, Emily was already waiting at the entrance. When she saw me, she tilted her head in surprise. "Oh, you again," she smiled. "Hi," I said, getting out of the car and opening the door for her. Emily got in the back and immediately started talking about her drawings. Lauren just smiled, watching her through the mirror. "Does she like to draw?" I asked. "Oh, yes. She spends hours with her paints. It's cool." When we pulled up to their house, Lauren paused for a second before getting out of the car. "Thanks for the ride. Can we do it again sometime?" "I'd love to." She smiled, and I realized that this was just the beginning. We started seeing each other more often. Lauren would sometimes invite me to dinner, would help her with Emily, and she and Lauren became a part of my life. One night we were sitting on the couch watching an old movie when Lauren said quietly, "Alex, I'm glad we met again." I looked at her, took her hand and just nodded. I did the same. This time I felt that everything would be different. And for the first time in a long time, I was sure that this was how it was supposed to be. The next few months flew by. I became a frequent guest at Lauren's house, and Emily began to take me for granted. She was always waiting for me when I came home from work and dragged me to show her my new drawings. One day, when I arrived on a Saturday morning, she met me at the door with a serious face and a notebook in her hands. "Alex, I have an important question for you," she said, shaking her head the way adults do when they are talking about something serious. I got down on one knee to be at her level. I listened carefully. She took a deep breath, as if she was preparing for an important conversation. "Are you my new dad now?" The question took me by surprise. I looked over at Lauren for a moment, who was standing behind Emily with a slight smile. "Well, I thought about how to answer. I'm not your dad, Emily, but if you don't mind, I'll be the one who's always there for you." She frowned slightly, but then shrugged. "Okay. But you still have to come with me to the school fair." "Deal," I smiled. The fair was a week later. Lauren and I helped out at the lemonade stand while Emily ran around with her friends. At one point, she ran up and pulled my hand. "Come on, I want to show you my art booth." We approached the wall with children's works. Among the dozens of colorful drawings, I saw her. She had drawn herself, Lauren, and me, my family. "Do you like it?" she asked, looking at me expectantly. I felt something tighten in my chest. "It's the best drawing I've ever seen, Emily." Lauren brought her hand to my shoulder and squeezed it lightly. "She thinks so." We stood there looking at it, and I realized that this was the point of no return. A year later, Lauren and I officially got married. It was a small ceremony and Emily was the one who carried the rings. After the wedding dinner, she ran up to me while Lauren was talking to the guests. "Alex, are you definitely my dad now?" I sat down to be at her level and hugged her. "I guess I am now." "Good," she squeezed me tighter, because I already told everyone at school. I laughed as I watched Lauren watch us from across the hall. In that moment, I realized that sometimes life brings you to the right people at the right time. Even if it means going through pain and loss. A few years later, life became so calm and stable that I sometimes found myself wondering if it was all a dream. Emily grew up incredibly fast. She became a part of my life so naturally that I couldn't imagine a day when she wasn't around. We went fishing together, built birdhouses in the yard, and spent whole evenings playing board games. One evening, when she was already a teenager, we were sitting on the terrace watching Lauren water the flowers. "Alex," Emily suddenly began seriously, "do you remember when I asked you if you would be my dad?" I smiled as I sipped my tea. "Yes, I do." "Well, I want to ask you something else." She looked at me seriously, like an adult. "Go ahead and ask." She hesitated a bit, but then sighed. "Could you be my official dad?" "Well, I mean, adopt me." I froze, trying to process these words. You really want to do that?" "Yes," she propped her chin on her hands, "I've been thinking about it for a long time." "You're already my dad. I just want to make it official." Lauren stopped, overhearing our conversation, and looked at me with a warm gaze. "This is a big decision, Emily." "I know," she looked up at Lauren and then at me, "but it's what I want." I put down my cup, got up from my chair, and sat down next to her. "If this is really important to you, Emily, then it's important to me." She hugged me, and I felt my heart fill with warmth. The adoption process took several months. In court, when the judge asked her the final question if she wanted me to be her legal father, Emily just smiled and said, "Yes, because he already is." Lauren squeezed my hand as the judge officially announced the decision. It was a moment I will remember for the rest of my life. That evening we had a small party at home, no fanfare, just family and a few friends. Emily came up to me with a cake in her hands, on which was written the phrase, "Thank you for having me." "Do you think it's a little too much?" she asked, but her eyes were shining with happiness. "No, it's perfect," I replied, wiping away a tear that suddenly appeared in my eyes. Life was simple, but it was filled with moments that made it real. And now I knew for sure that every step, every difficult road, every broken heart had brought me exactly where I was supposed to be. To the family that became my true home. Several years have passed since the day I officially became Emily's father. Time passed, but that feeling never faded. She grew up, graduated from high school with honors and entered a university in another city. It was hard to say goodbye. Lauren and I stood by her car while she loaded her last few things. "Are you sure you don't want me to drive you?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. Emily smiled and hugged me. "I'll be fine, Daddy." Every time she called me that, I felt something warm and strong rise up in my chest. "Call me at least once a week," Lauren said, wiping her eyes as if it were just dust. "I'll call every day," Emily replied as she got behind the wheel. "You know me." She waved at us and drove off, leaving only a trail of tires on the road and the silence that enveloped the yard. Lauren and I stood there in silence for a few minutes, staring after her. "Do you remember the first time you gave her a ride home after club?" Lauren said quietly. "Like it was yesterday," I replied. We returned to the house, which seemed a little quieter than usual. Emily called almost every day. Sometimes we just sat on the phone in silence, doing our own thing, sometimes we talked for hours about her studies, new friends, and plans for the future. One night she called and said she was dating a guy. "His name is Jacob," she said with that note in her voice that made it clear that she was serious. "And what do you think of him?" "He's nice. But I want you to meet him before you make any conclusions." I smiled. "I hope he's ready for a rigorous test." "Oh, I already told him that my dad is serious." When they arrived for the weekend, I wasn't going to interrogate him, but Jacob still looked a little tense. "Nice to meet you, sir," he said, shaking my hand. "Alex," I corrected, "sir makes me feel old." Jacob relaxed and laughed. I saw something familiar in him, the sincerity that had once helped me find my place in Lauren and Emily's lives. A few more years passed, and one Sunday evening, as Lauren and I were sitting on the porch, Emily called. "Dad, we have some news." Lauren knew right away. I looked at her and she just smiled mysteriously. "Jacob asked me to marry him." I held my breath for a moment, but quickly gathered myself. And what did you say? Of course, I said yes. Lauren raised her wine glass and winked at me. Congratulations to you both. And if you need help planning your wedding, your mom is already sharpening her pencils. I know that, Emily laughed, I love you. I heard Lauren whisper softly, me too, and I just looked up at the sky full of stars. We love you too, Emily. When I hung up the phone, Lauren sat down closer and put her head on my shoulder. Do you realize that now you will have not just a daughter, but also a son-in-law? The main thing is that he loves her as much as I do, I answered, squeezing her hand. Emily and Jacob's wedding was modest but cozy. They decided to hold the ceremony in a small garden near our house. Lauren did all the organizing, and I've never seen her so enthusiastic about the process. On the wedding day, Emily looked incredible. When she came up to me before the ceremony, I was almost speechless. Dad, are you going to cry now? She teased me, seeing me brush away a tear. I don't rule it out, I answered, adjusting her veil, but these are tears of happiness. She hugged me as tightly as she had when I was a child. Thank you for everything, she whispered, I can't imagine where I would be without you. I took a deep breath and walked her down the aisle. Jacob stood there, looking a little nervous but happy. There was something familiar in his eyes, the same rapturous look I'd once given Lauren. The wedding went by quickly, and soon after, Emily and Jacob moved to a new house in a neighboring town. Lauren and I went to visit them often. One day, a year after the wedding, we were all sitting together in their garden. Emily invited me to go for a walk. Jacob and I have some news, she said, looking at me a little nervously but with a smile. Oh, you got a new car? I jokingly suggested. She laughed and shook her head. No, Dad. We're expecting a baby. I stopped, staring into her eyes, trying to process what I had just heard. Wow, I finally managed to get out. I'm going to be a grandfather. Yes, and I can't wait for you to hold this little miracle in your arms again. My eyes filled with tears. I hugged her without saying another word. All the emotions that had accumulated over the years came out in that moment. When their daughter was born, they named her Lily, in honor of Lauren, who was incredibly touched by this decision. I remember the day I held Lily in my arms for the first time. Her tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb and I realized that this was a new chapter in my life. She looks just like Emily when she was a baby, Lauren whispered, looking at Lily and me. I hope she'll be just as strong and kind, I replied, rocking her in my arms. Every year I saw our family grow and become stronger. Lauren and I enjoyed our time with Lily, taking her to parks, reading her bedtime stories, and taking her fishing. And taking her fishing on the same lake where I used to take Emily. One summer day, we all gathered in our garden to celebrate Lily's birthday. She was turning 5, and she had already become a real little star in our family. Jacob was grilling, Emily was decorating the table, and Lauren was running around with the cake and candles. Lily ran up to me holding her new crayons. Grandpa, I drew you, she said, handing me a drawing. On the sheet was me, a little funny, with a big nose and a huge fish in my hands. Did you see that fish, Lily? It's bigger than me. I joked, looking at her creation. That's because you are the best fisherman. I laughed and picked her up. Thank you, Lily. This is the best gift ever. In the evening, as the guests began to leave, I sat on the terrace with Lauren, watching Lily run around the garden with Jacob. It's a blessing, Lauren said, putting her head on my shoulder. Yes, I agreed, squeezing her hand, I couldn't imagine a better life. She raised her head and looked me in the eyes. You know, Alex, sometimes I think, if things had happened differently, we might never have met. I thought for a second and then smiled. Maybe. But I believe we would have found each other anyway. Lauren snuggled closer, and we looked up at the stars in silence, listening to our granddaughter's laughter echoing in the darkness. In that moment, I realized that life is a series of small moments that create a big story. And my story was exactly where I wanted it to be, at home, among the people I love. The following years flew by quickly, as they always do when life is filled with love, family warmth, and quiet joys. Lily grew up before my eyes, and each new chapter of her life reminded me of Emily as a child. One evening, when Lily was already 10, she sat down on my porch. It was a quiet evening, and we just watched the sun disappear behind the horizon. "Grandpa, have you ever been sad?" she suddenly asked, playing with a thread on her sweater. I thought for a moment. "Yes, I have. Everyone gets sad sometimes." She nodded, but kept her eyes on me seriously. "When did you stop being sad?" I smiled and gently fixed her hair. "When I met your grandma Lauren and your mom. They made my life brighter. And then you came along and I was never sad again." Lily smiled and sat down closer. "Then I want to be like that too, so that people around me are happy." "You're already doing that, Lily," I said, holding her close. When Lily finished school, she was as independent and confident as her mother. She was interested in art and planned to go to a design university. On the day of her graduation, I stood with Lauren and Jacob outside the school, watching Lily receive her diploma. "Did you realize that you and I have become the very support group that will follow her throughout her life?" Lauren whispered, smiling. "Yes, and I'm okay with that," I replied, squeezing her hand. Lily ran up to us after the ceremony, diploma in hand, and hugged us one by one. "Grandpa, do you remember how I said I wanted to be like you?" "Yes, Lily, I remember." She raised her diploma above her head. "It's a start." My eyes got a little moist, but I just smiled and patted her shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Lily. Very proud." Another year passed. Lily went to study in another city, but we often talked. She sent photos of her projects, and Lauren and I visited her exhibitions. One day, when we returned from another trip to visit Lily, I sat on the porch, feeling a little tired. Lauren brought 2 cups of tea and sat down next to me. "Did you think this life would be like this?" she asked, watching the evening sky. I looked at her and smiled. Honestly, I never would have thought. But I wouldn't trade a single day with him. Lauren took my hand and we sat in silence, enjoying this simple but priceless moment. Life always has its surprises. But if you have people you love by your side, any path becomes the right one. And I knew that my story was far from over. Years passed, but in my heart I felt that time seemed to stand still in those moments when we all got together. Our house remained the same place where the family would come back to, for Christmas, Thanksgiving, or just for no reason at all. Lily finished her studies and started working in an architectural company. One weekend, she came home for the weekend and brought with her a project for a new residential complex she was working on. She laid out the blueprints on the living room table and started explaining every detail while Lauren and I sat next to her and listened intently. "There will be a park with a lake over here. I thought a little fishing spot would be a good idea," she said, circling a small area on the plan. I laughed. "So now you're incorporating our memories into architectural designs?" Lily smiled and shrugged. "Someone once told me that simple things create the best moments in life." I put my arm around her shoulders. And it's true. A year later, Lily called late at night. "Dad, I have news for you and Mom," she began with that note of excitement I've heard many times before. "What's wrong?" Lauren had already leaned closer, trying to eavesdrop on the conversation. "I'm getting married." I felt Lauren squeeze my hand. "Wow." I laughed, "That's great news. Would you be willing to have the ceremony in our garden? It would be very symbolic for me." Lauren grabbed the phone and said with a smile. Lily, you don't even have to ask. We're already planning as you speak. Lily's wedding was just as simple and warm as Lauren's and my own. Jacob and Emily helped with the preparations, and I spent a few weeks getting the garden in perfect condition. On the day of the wedding, I stood next to Lauren, holding her hand as Lily said her vows to the man she planned to spend the rest of her life with. When everyone started dancing, Lily came up to me and put her head on my shoulder. Thank you for everything, Daddy. I gave her a big hug and returned it. It was the best thing that could have happened to me in my life, being your father. A few more years passed. Lauren and I became grandparents for the second time. Lily gave birth to a boy, and she decided to name him Alex. When I first held him in my arms, I realized it was the same feeling as with Emily, as with Lily. The wheel of life was turning again. One day I was sitting on the porch with little Alex in my arms. He was falling asleep while Lauren sat next to me and held my hand. Do you think he'll become a fisherman? She asked quietly. I laughed. If not, we'll show him what it's all about. We sat there, listening to the wind rustle softly in the trees, and I realized that happiness is the continuation of a story